Окей. Да, да, потому что были какие-то яркие цветовые пятна, они мешали. Так лучше, хотя все равно там вот эти... Ой, слушай, открой дверки, может быть, из шкафа, чтобы они не отсвечивали. Да, да. Да, спасибо.
Я посмотрела на том компьютере твою картинку. Сейчас лучше.
Окей. 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 Так. И чай есть? Налей, пожалуйста. Все.
С вопросами разобрались. И я буду передавать. Там будут печатать.
А зачем мне это все будет в чате? Зачем?
Я не знаю, как договорились. Там распечатывать вопросы.
Хорошо. Не надо там ничего приносить, я буду видеть.
А будешь
Ага.
отбирать как-то надо?
Придется самой. Spencer, I'm sorry. Somebody asked us to tell a joke about Shakespeare and COVID. Somebody, Maxim Sidorov.
They want to tell a joke about Shakespeare and the vaccine.
Yeah.
So there was so one joke yesterday was do you know when you put in, it's called a jab. You jab your arm with a needle.
Yeah.
So the one was to jab or not to jab. And then somebody else said two gentlemen from Corona. Instead, there's the Shakespeare Two Gentlemen from Verona, and instead it was Two Gentlemen from Corona,
I see.
which is quite good.
Good.
So there was lots of funny jokes about Shakespeare and the vaccine yesterday.
I see.
Colleagues, can we start now?
Yes.
Наталья Ивановна. And I'm not sure, can everyone hear us okay? Can you please confirm?
Yes, 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 yes.
Yes.
I can see in chat box that some people do not hear us. Can you try and change your channel?
My channel?
No, Natalia, just for
The
people
guests.
who can't hear.
Коллеги, кто только присоединился и не слышит нас, попробуйте поменять канал перевода.
Ну, я буду говорить по-русски. Сейчас слышно меня? Я буду говорить по-русски. Меня слышно? Все молчат. Ну, вы еще не включали, наверное, да? А вот теперь... Видишь,
Все отлично.
Да, хорошо. Потому что, да, я выбрала русский и буду говорить по-русски. Но я сейчас об этом скажу, да. Угу.
Jonathan, we need to unmute Maxim, the translator, and make him a co-host. I'm sorry.
Okay. So we start? Мы начинаем?
Да, начинаем.
Так, окей. Дорогие коллеги, дорогие участники семинара, все, кто к нам присоединился, сегодня мы начинаем нашу традиционную встречу, на которой будет представлен энергетический прогноз Energy Outlook, подготовленный компанией BP. Сегодня презентацию делает Спенсер Дейл, главный экономист компании BP. Я хочу напомнить некоторые особенности нашей сегодняшней встречи, некоторые технические детали на самом деле. Прежде всего, все слушатели имеют возможность выбрать язык, на котором они хотят слышать эту презентацию. У вас в Zoom внизу на нижней панели есть иконки. Обратите на них, пожалуйста, внимание. Есть иконка, которая указывает на английский язык. Она вторая справа, если вы смотрите. Вы выбираете русский или английский. Соответственно, вы будете слышать либо русскую речь, либо английскую. Я буду говорить сегодня по-русски, потому что большинство участников нашей встречи русские, но доступен английский перевод. Если вы хотите слушать Джонатана и меня в английском варианте, вы тогда переключаетесь на английский. Это первое. Второе. Технически, как обычно, сначала Джонатан делает презентацию, это займет примерно час, а потом у нас будет сессия вопросов и ответов. Отличие сегодняшнего дня заключается в том, что вопросы я прошу вас задавать в чате. Вы видите, это иконка чата, она посередине примерно нижней линейки зума. Вы там можете набирать текст своего вопроса. Вы можете это делать по-русски или по-английски. И я буду читать эти вопросы. Соответственно, если по-русски переводчик будет переводить, а если по-английски, то, значит, Джонатан сразу поймет, как сформулирован ваш вопрос в оригинале. Ну, у нас вряд ли будет время на устные комментарии, хотя Спенсер не возражает против того, чтобы кто-то выступил или что-то добавил. Здесь только технические могут быть трудности, но если кто-то настаивает, напишите в чате, что вы хотите в устной форме задать свой вопрос или выступить с комментарием, если останется время. Вот, кажется, технические подробности все. Теперь я скажу несколько вводных слов с тем, чтобы напомнить некоторые особенности той продукции, которую сегодня нам представляет Спенсер. Вы знаете, что помимо нефти, газа, энергетических ресурсов, компания BP известна своей экономической аналитикой. И два главных продукта, которые все энергетики мира и все эксперты знают, это BP статистический ежегодник, и он начал выпускаться с 1965 года, и ни разу не было прекращения. Это такой статистический источник, где компания как бы отражает реальность, то, что происходит ежегодно, и все подробные аналитические данные, которыми пользуются большинство аналитиков энергетического рынка мира, вы можете найти в статистическом приложении. Но 10 лет назад, то есть у нас сегодня своеобразный юбилей, у нас 10-й Outlook, который подготовила компания BP. Я также рада сообщить, что с первого до последнего все эти Outlook'и были представлены на площадке ИМЭМО. Начинал Кристофер Рюль, последние несколько лет это делает Спенсер Дейл, и мы очень ценим и наше взаимодействие с компанией BP по этому вопросу. Мы считаем, что эти Outlook'и являются наиболее цитируемыми, наиболее надежными и наиболее, поскольку они последовательно делаются 10 лет, они наиболее тщательно и внимательно отбирают информацию и очень представляют собой ценный материал. Я хочу сказать, что Спенсер всегда подчеркивает, что компания не боится вносить какие-то изменения. Прогноз делается долгосрочный, на 20 лет, нынешний на 30 лет вперед. И каждый год компания смотрит, что случилось за год, что можно исправить, подкорректировать, какие сделать акценты на то, чтобы лучше отразить фактически реальность, которая таким образом качественно представлена в этом прогнозе. С моей точки зрения, то, что делает компания BP, можно назвать тем, что у нас в России называется формирование образа будущего, желаемый образ будущего, как с точки зрения того, что той реальности, в которой мы находимся сейчас, куда мы будем двигаться, как мы будем двигаться, в каком направлении, какие ресурсы здесь нужны. Это очень важная работа, которой с нами делится, причем рассуждениями по ходу того, как делается эта работа. С нами любезно делится вся компания и Спенсер Дейл. Я, пожалуй, на этом закончу. Мне кажется, это самое важное, что мы должны знать о том, что мы сегодня услышим. И я надеюсь на ваше заинтересованное внимание и на то, что вы зададите вопросы, которые так любит Спенсер Дейл. Пожалуйста.
Thank you very much, Natalia, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Looking at all the names on the chat list of the participants, it's a great pleasure to see so many old friends and colleagues, and it's just a shame I can't be with you in person. I was looking, as I was chatting to Natalia, I was looking through her window and I see the sun is shining in Moscow today. And I was telling Natalia and Luba that one of the big TV shows in the UK at the moment is based around the old story of America trying to beat Russia at chess. And the final episode was I watched it last night, and it was set in Moscow, and there's these beautiful scenes of the Red Square and the Basil Cathedral. So I was missing Moscow a lot, and I was missing my regular trips to Moscow. So thank you again for the Institute for hosting us today. I think, as you say, the 10th time we've done the annual Energy Outlook at the Institute, but the first time virtually. And I hope that next year we'll be able to be back in person. One thing which has changed this year is we normally produce the Energy Outlook in the spring of each year. But this year we only published it in September. And that change reflected two features, or two things. One was COVID, the pandemic, and we wanted to delay the publication so we could update the outlook to at least include an estimate of the impact of the pandemic. But it also reflected the fact that BP this year announced a very significant shift in its strategy as a company, shifting from a international oil company to an integrated energy company. And this year's energy outlook was used quite heavily to shape that strategy, to help influence what that strategy should look like. So we wanted to publish the energy outlook alongside the strategy so we could show you how the outlook had influenced the strategy. So that's why we also delayed it. And I'll start by giving a little background about the sort of features that we used from the outlook to help shape our strategy. So if we move to the next slide, this year's outlook is slightly different to the past outlooks in the sense that it's framed around three scenarios, and all three scenarios are discussed equally through the report. The orange rapid scenario assumes a significant increase in carbon prices and other forms of climate policies, such that carbon emissions fall by around 70% by 2050 compared to their current levels. The blue net zero scenario builds on the increase in carbon prices and climate policies by assuming that there's a significant shift in consumers and companies' behaviors and preferences, which further accentuates the fall in carbon emissions, such that, as the name suggests, carbon emissions are almost entirely eliminated by 2050 in the blue net zero scenario. And finally, we also consider a business as usual scenario, shown here in green, which assumes the rate of progress in climate policies, technology, and preferences continue to increase and improve at a similar rate seen in the recent past. That's sufficient to cause carbon emissions to peak in the mid-2020s, but as you can see from this chart, relatively little progress is made in terms of decarbonising the energy system, with carbon emissions, back one please, Jonathan, with carbon emissions only 10% below their current levels by 2050. Now, one key point, which I think I've often stressed in the past, but it matters even more this year than ever before, is to recognise that all of these scenarios will be wrong. We can't predict the future. We know we can't predict the future. When we think about the use of these scenarios in BP, we don't think about trying to guess which of these scenarios is more or less likely. Rather, we use these scenarios to help build a picture of the range of uncertainty that we could face over the next 20 or 30 years as a company. And then once we have a better understanding of that range of uncertainty, we can then build a strategy which is robust and resilient to that range of uncertainty. And I'll explain more about that as we go along, but that's how we are using these scenarios. It's not possible to directly map these scenarios to the Paris climate goals, because these scenarios only deal with carbon emissions from the energy sector. So they don't think about all greenhouse gas emissions. And moreover, they only go out to 2050. So they don't go out to 2100, which we would need to do to think about climate. But what we show in the outlook is we can compare these pathways with the pathways contained in the scenarios in the last year's IPCC report, which do consider all greenhouse gases going out to 2100. And that's shown in this next chart, please. So the pink swathe here shows the range of IPCC scenarios which are consistent with maintaining temperatures well below 2 degrees C. And you can see that rapid scenario is pretty much in the middle of that pink swathe and is actually spookily close to the median IPCC scenario consistent with maintaining temperatures well below 2 degrees C. If we compare the net zero scenario with the blue swathe, which is the range of IPCC scenarios consistent with maintaining temperature rises below 1.5 degrees, you can see that the pace at which carbon emissions decline initially in net zero is somewhat slower than that range, but by the end of the outlook, it's towards the bottom end of that 1.5 degree range. So the way we think about this is both rapid and net zero are consistent, look to be broadly consistent with the Paris climate goals, with the rapid more consistent with scenarios which maintain temperatures well below 2 degrees C, and net zero consistent with maintaining temperatures below 1.5 degrees. These pathways show the carbon pathways for the global energy system. If we look at the next slide, thank you, Jonathan. This just shows those same carbon pathways for just for Russia. And you can see here that the fall in carbon emissions in the rapid and net zero scenarios are very similar to the global story. So about 70% in rapid and almost entirely eliminated in net zero. In contrast, in business as usual, the fall in carbon emissions is a bit quicker than the global average, with carbon emissions falling by around 25% relative to the global average in business as usual, which is about 10%. So when thinking about how we can use these scenarios, one way we tried to help use the scenarios to shape our strategy was to say, are there some features of energy demand which are common across all three of these scenarios? Now, these scenarios are by no means comprehensive, but they do span a pretty broad range of uncertainty from a business as usual case to a fairly aggressive net zero by 2050 case. And so if we can see some features of energy demand which are common across all three of those scenarios, that may give us some confidence that those features may materialize. And in the outlook, we identify three key trends which help shape BP's core beliefs. So we go to the next slide. And one more, Jonathan. So this first trend that we identified is that the share of fossil fuels in primary energy is likely to declines over time in all three of the scenarios. So the share of fossil fuels in primary energy today is, as everybody knows, is around 85%. So coal, oil, natural gas, about 85% of the world's energy. In those three scenarios, that share declines to between 65% in business as usual and 20% in net zero. What is striking is that in all three of these scenarios, the absolute demand of fossil fuels declines over the next 30 years. That would be entirely unprecedented in terms of the history of the energy system. If you look back at the history of the energy system, we haven't seen a sustained decline in the consumption of any traded fuel. The share of coal has declined over time, and the share of oil has declined over time, but the absolute demand for coal and oil has continued to rise. In all three of these scenarios, the aggregate demand for fossil fuels declines over the next 30 years. So suggesting that even in the business as usual case, we're moving into uncharted territories. If we move to the next slide, Jonathan, that declining share in fossil fuels is largely offset by the increasing importance of renewables in the energy system. Renewable energy here is defined as wind and solar power, together with bioenergy and geothermal energy. As defined, renewables account for around 5% of energy today, primary energy today, and that share rises to between 20 and 60% in the three scenarios. It's striking also that in all three of these scenarios, the pace at which renewables penetrate the energy system is quicker than any fuel ever seen in history. So the pace at which the share of renewables increases is faster than any other fuel has increased its share in history. So again, in all three of these scenarios, suggesting that the pace of change of the energy system is likely to be unprecedented. And the third feature of that we highlight in the next slide is that this increasing role for renewables goes hand in hand with an increasing share of electricity in total final energy consumption as the world continues to electrify. So significant uncertainty about the precise timing and pace of these trends. But the fact that we see these three trends, this declining share of fossil fuels, very rapid growth of renewable energy, going hand in hand with electrification of the energy system, help to underpin some core beliefs that BP built into its new strategy. Now, this is the chart for global energy demand. The next slide shows those same trends for Russian energy demand. And you can see the same trends are still there in Russia. What is striking about the Russian trends is that the business as usual case, the trends are far more modest or are far less pronounced in the business as usual case for Russia, but they're far more pronounced in those two decarbonisation scenarios. In that sense, I was quite interesting in the Russian story here, where the story in business usual is quite limited, because if we look across other parts of the world, we see these trends also being most apparent. So if you go to the next slide, Jonathan, this is that same slide for China, and you can see those same trends apparent in China. The next slide shows the same trends again for India. You can see those same trends are common in India. And the next slide is for the EU. Again, you see those same trends are common across all three scenarios, again in EU as well. And finally, Jonathan, the next slide. We also see those same trends in the US. So what I found striking and what we helped underpin our core beliefs is we look across a whole range of countries, a whole range of scenarios, and we see these three features which are pretty common across all three. This challenged role for fossil fuels, this very rapid growth in renewables, and this increasing electrification of the energy system. And they help underpin BP's core beliefs about energy demand. We also use the scenarios to help think about the strategy by thinking about how global energy markets may also change. So in addition to energy demand, how energy markets may change over time. And to do that, we looked at the rapid scenario shown in this next slide. So this looks at energy shares in the rapid scenario. Now, just to be clear here, there's nothing special about rapid. It will be wrong. I don't want to look at the precise profiles here. What I want to do is look at some generic features of rapid to see how the energy systems may evolve as and when we see a shift to a low carbon energy system. Remember that rapid is consistent with Paris, well below 2 degrees C. And this chart is different to the ones I've shown you up to now because it starts in 1900. So I'm looking at over 100 years of history here. And the reason here is because I want to contrast how the future of the energy system may look very different to what we have seen in history in terms of the nature of the energy system. Now, as many people on this call will know far better than I, the energy system in the past has tended to be dominated by one or two fuels. So for much of the first half of the last century, energy demand was dominated by coal, shown in that very large black share of coal in the first half of the last century. As the share of coal declined in the 1960s and 70s, you saw the emergence of oil as the dominant source of energy. If you look ahead over the next 30 years, you see a far more diverse energy mix, with oil, natural gas, together with wind, solar, nuclear, other non-fossil fuels, all providing sizable amounts of energy to power the world, with increasingly that fuel mix being driven by customer choice rather than fuel availability. If you were a customer in the 1930s, an energy consumer in the 1930s, you didn't have a choice what energy to consume. Your energy choice was either largely coal or coal. If you're in the 2030s, you have a far more diverse range of energies from which you can choose from. And so we're seeing this shift in energy markets away from upstream producers, increasingly to be driven by customer choice. That increasing customer choice and diversity of energy fuels means we think there's going to be an increasing role for energy companies that can help integrate across those sources of energy, allowing consumers to choose the range of energies that they can pick from. We also think energy markets will become increasingly localized, reflecting the increasing role of electricity and later on hydrogen, since those energy carriers are more costly and less efficient to transfer long distances. And perhaps the most important change that we think will be triggered by this shift in the energy system is we think energy markets will become more competitive. If you were a coal producer in the 1930s, you didn't have to compete against many other fuels. You were the only option. If you're a coal producer in the 2030s, you have to compete against natural gas, wind, solar, nuclear, other non-fossil fuels to ensure that your coal is consumed. And so we will see far greater competition across fuels. And we also think you're going to see far greater competition within fuels, particularly within coal, oil, and natural gas, as the resource owners compete to ensure that their resources are produced and consumed against a backdrop of falling demand. So increasing competition both across fuels and within fuels. And we think that's likely to lead to a shift in the profit share away from upstream producers, with some of that profit share staying in the downstream for energy companies who are helping energy consumers to optimize across these range of fuels, but much of that rent flowing to energy consumers in the form of lower priced, more competitive energy. So another set of core beliefs underpinning BP strategy is this sort of shift in energy markets away from the power of upstream producers, and that center of gravity shifting to customers and consumers, far greater customer choice, more competitive energy markets, energy and economic rents shifting to the consumer away from the upstream producer. And that's another set of core beliefs which underpin BP's strategy. So some views about how we were using the outlook to underpin our strategy, and we can talk more about that during the question and answer session. If we move to the next slide, I just wanted, so that's sort of some things about, although the world is very uncertain, there are some things we think we do know in terms of those common trends. I wanted to spend the rest of my time in terms of the presentation by thinking about three questions. What role for the outlook for oil demand? What role can natural gas play in the energy transition? And finally, what role for hydrogen? And I've picked on hydrogen in particular because I'd be very interested to hear people's views about the role that Russia may well be able to play in the hydrogen economy. And I know since I was last in Moscow, Russia has announced its hydrogen strategy, which I confess I still haven't fully understood. So I'd be interested to understand people's views on that. So first of all, in terms of the outlook for oil demand, if we go to the next chart, Jonathan. This profile shows the outlook for oil demand in the three scenarios. As we all know, oil demand has fallen very substantially as a result of COVID. In rapid and net zero, although we see some recovery in oil demand never fully recovers back to its pre-COVID levels. And so it appears in those scenarios, oil demand never gets back to its peak level of 2019. And so COVID has the impact of bringing forward the peaking in oil demand in those two scenarios. And oil demand in those two scenarios, rapid and net zero, then declined continuously over the next 30 years, falling to around 50 million barrels a day by 2050 in rapid, and to around 25 million barrels a day in net zero. In the business as usual case, oil demand recovers to above its pre-COVID levels, but remains broadly flat at around 100 million barrels a day for the next 10 or 15 years or so, and then gradually declines and drifts down slightly to around 90 million barrels a day by 2050. In all three of these scenarios, the big factor driving the reduction in oil demand is reducing use of oil in road transportation. And that reduction in the use of oil in road transportation is driven by a combination of the increasing efficiency of internal combustion engine vehicles, together with an increasing electrification of passenger cars and light and medium duty heavy trucks. Some people, when we published the outlook, got very excited by saying, BP are saying that oil demand has peaked. BP is saying there's no future for oil. And this was, as always, with newspapers, not what we were saying. I think what we were saying was twofold. One is, we don't know if oil demand has peaked or not. The impact of COVID has brought forward, in our view, the likely peaking of oil demand. In some scenarios, it has peaked, and in other scenarios, it hasn't. So the genuine question is, we don't know. The other genuine question is, we don't really care, because in all three of these scenarios, even if oil demand has peaked, it continues to play a very material role in the energy system for many years to come. I fear that many journalists, when you say oil demand has peaked, they confuse peaking in oil demand for oil no longer playing a role, where oil continues to play a very material role in all three of these scenarios. And that is brought home if we look at this next chart. And some of you may remember similar charts I've shown at the Institute in the past, but it's an important point to show. So the three colored lines here are exactly the same as on the left-hand side. They just show the profiles for oil demand in the three scenarios. And that black dotted line shows a hypothetical profile for oil production if the world was to stop investing in new greenfield investment sites. And the point it makes is that even in the net zero scenario, the world still needs to make trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in new oil production over the next 10 or 15 years in order for the world to be able to provide the oil that the world needs to continue to grow and prosper. So even in that net zero scenario, where oil demand has peaked, it falls by 75% to 25 million barrels a day by 2050. We still need to see trillions and trillions of dollars of new investment in oil production over the next 10 or 15 years. And that's, I think, an important message, which was very clear in our outlook, but many people failed or chose not to hear it. In terms of what this means for oil production, if we can move to the next slide, Jonathan. In the business as usual case, Russian production, which is shown here in the purple bars on the left-hand panel here, Russian production in business as usual is broadly flat at around 11 or 12 million barrels a day, all the way out to 2050. And that's a story that we have been showing pretty much in our outlooks for the business as usual case or the evolving transition for some time now, that Russian production is able to fight off the base decline and to keep production levels flat, but does not see significant increases. In the business as usual case, the main action is between US tight oil on the one side and OPEC on the other side. So initially, what we see in business as usual is US tight oil increase over the next 10 or 15 years to over 15 million barrels a day. As US tight oil increases, given the relatively flat demand that we see in business as usual, that forces a reduction in OPEC supplies. However, as US tight oil peaks in the early 2030s and starts to decline, that allows OPEC production to increase, and it increases back towards its current level. So you see the sort of initially the first half driven by increasing share of US tight oil with OPEC acquiescing, and then that largely reversing in the second half. In contrast, in the rapid scenario where you see this sort of fall off in oil demand, particularly in the second half of the outlook, US oil production stays broadly flat over the next 10 or 15 years, but then declines along with pretty much all other types of oil production, including the US, including OPEC, with Russian production falling to around 7 million barrels a day by 2050 in that rapid scenario. So that gives you a sense about how we are perceiving the nature of oil production alongside these demand profiles. If we move to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about the role that natural gas can play in the energy transition. And so we go to the next slide, Jonathan. This slide shows exactly the same demand profiles, but this time for natural gas rather than for oil. And the big message to take from these, one big message to take from these profiles is that the demand outlook for natural gas is far more resilient than it is for oil. So if you look, for example, in that rapid scenario, the rapid scenario that I just showed you for oil demand, or oil demand in that rapid scenario, you may recall oil demand already peaked in 2019 and fell by around 50% by 2050. In contrast, the demand for natural gas in rapid continues to increase for the next 15 years. It then starts to decline, but it only goes back to roughly its current levels. And this resilience of natural gas is underpinned by two features. First, it's underpinned by the role that natural gas can play, particularly in emerging market economies as they decarbonize in the rapid scenario. So an example of this would be a country like India, which has many features which are replicated in other parts of Southeast Asia. And there's two key features of the Indian economy which affects the nature of its decarbonization. First, it starts with relatively high levels of coal consumption. The levels of coal consumption in India accounts for well over 60% of primary energy. And any decarbonization pathway, it critically depends on reducing the levels of coal consumption. But the challenge of reducing that coal consumption is made harder because energy demand in India is continuing to increase very rapidly. So when we think about decarbonization pathways, the natural thing is to grow carbon-free energy, wind and solar power, as quickly as possible. But in countries like India, it's not possible to grow wind and solar power sufficiently quickly to both meet all the growth in new energy demand and also replace all the existing use of coal. And so what you see is a strong growth in natural gas, particularly over the first 15 years of the outlook, with natural gas going alongside renewable energy, allowing for this reduction in coal consumption. And that role of natural gas in helping to support renewable energy in decarbonization pathways, particularly in emerging Asia, but also in parts of Africa, Latin America, helps to really underpin the robustness of natural gas in the first part of the outlook. And then further out, in the second half of the outlook, the resilience of natural gas is aided by the increasing use of natural gas combined with CCUS to provide a form of zero or near zero carbon power, either directly into industry or the power sector, or alternatively to produce blue hydrogen. And I'll say a little bit more about blue hydrogen in a moment. In terms of the implications this has for Russian gas production, you can see in this next slide here, the patterns of growth in Russian gas production broadly mimic those we see for the global outlook. So if in that rapid scenario, you see a growth in Russian gas production in the first half of the outlook, where it's helping to support the world decarbonize, increasing to over 800 BCM by the 2030s. And then it falls back to pretty much around its current level by 2050. In contrast, in the business as usual case, you see continuing strong growth of Russian natural gas, with increasing to over 900 BCM by 2050. A key part of this story where natural gas is helping to support decarbonisation in emerging markets is much of that is coming via traded gas, and so we see significant increases in gas trade, and in particular in the importance of liquefied natural gas, LNG, which is shown in this next slide, where we see LNG demand more than doubles in both the rapid scenario and the business as usual scenario. The way to read this chart is on the left-hand side, it shows you the breakdown of countries which are importing the LNG, and the right-hand side, the countries which are exporting the LNG. On the demand side, on the import side, that growth of LNG is driven by emerging Asia. So the core markets today of Japan and Korea, largely flat and starting to slowly decline. But what you see is this very strong growth in China, India, other parts of emerging Asia driving the LNG demand. And on the export side, the combination of the US in green and the Middle East, particularly Qatar, in orange, emerging as the dominant export hubs for LNG. But there's also, as you can see here in purple, a significant expansion in Russian LNG exports from around 25 BCM in 2018 to over 100 BCM by 2035 in both business as usual and the rapid scenario. So we're building in here a significant expansion over the next 10 to 15 years of Russian LNG exports. And I'd be very happy for people to tell me if that's too optimistic or if I'm being too pessimistic in terms of the prospects for Russian LNG exports. The other key feature, obviously, for Russian exports is what's happening in Europe and for pipeline exports, which is what's shown here in this next slide. And so what I've done here is broke down these bars show total gas consumption in Europe, and then it shows there's various sources of supply meeting that gas consumption. So orange here is domestic production, purple is pipeline exports from Russia, and the light blue is LNG imports. In the business as usual case, which is to the right of the chart, Europe's consumption of natural gas declines, so the bar gets smaller than the 2018 numbers, but the decline in domestic production is more than outweighs the fall in aggregate consumption. And so you see an increase of imports into Europe, with both Russian pipeline imports and LNG imports both expanding in that scenario. In contrast, in the rapid scenario, you see a far more pronounced fall in European gas consumption, particularly in the second half of the outlook, So in that scenario, Russian pipeline exports to Europe remain broadly flat over the next 10 or 15 years, but then you see a more pronounced fall in Russian exports to Europe, pipeline gas exports to Europe by the second half of the outlook. And clearly, and we've discussed at the Institute many times in the past, a key feature here is the sort of competition between Russian and LNG exports, which will be a function both of the economics of that competition, but also some of the politics of that trade. And the assumptions underpinning here, as you can look at these charts, is the share of Russian pipeline exports, or the share of Russian imports in terms of Europe's total imports, declines slightly in these scenarios, with LNG taking share. But in contrast, the share of Russian pipeline imports in terms of Europe's total gas consumption actually increases in these scenarios. So one thing when we think about Europe's those sort of political issues and that dependency issues, there's a question mark about, do you measure dependency in terms of the importance of Russia in terms of total gas consumption, or the importance of Russia in terms of total gas imports? And you get slightly different stories depending on which of those two you look at. I'm conscious of time, so let me just turn to the final question in the next slide, which just talks about the role of hydrogen. So the story here, as many people will be familiar with, that when you think about decarbonisation pathways for the world, the starting point is to decarbonise the power sector and electrify everything that you possibly can. But then we know that there are parts of the energy system which can't be easily be electrified: long distance transportation, high temperature heat processes in industry, and that provides a role for other forms of energy and energy carriers, including hydrogen. And so what we find is, when we look at the role for hydrogen, we do not see a significant emergence of hydrogen in the business as usual scenario, but we do see a more important role for hydrogen in those rapid and net zero scenarios. So scenarios in which the world is decarbonising at a rate consistent with meeting Paris, you see a greater role for hydrogen. So if you go to the next slide, Jonathan. So this shows that increasing role for hydrogen in rapid and net zero scenarios. And you can see it's pretty much a sort of second half outlook. So even in those scenarios, not a material role for hydrogen in the first half of the outlook, but increasingly important role for hydrogen in the second half of the outlook, with hydrogen accounting for between sort of 6% of total final energy in rapid and about 15% of total final energy in net zero. And if you look at the colors here, you can see the majority of that hydrogen is going into the industry, shown in red here, helping to decarbonize particular high temperature heat processes, and also into transportation, shown in the light blue here, where we see a particularly important role for hydrogen in terms of long distance heavy duty road haulage. So the emergence of hydrogen or fuel cell heavy duty long distance trucks. In terms of how that hydrogen is produced, shown in the next slide. Today, so as many people on this call will know, there's sort of two predominant ways in which one can make hydrogen. One can make hydrogen with using renewable power and electrolysis of water, which is so-called green hydrogen. Alternatively, it can be made by capturing the methane in particularly natural gas, and capturing the carbon emissions from that natural gas in CCUS, so-called blue hydrogen. In many parts of the world today, blue hydrogen starts at quite a significant cost advantage, but we think the cost of green hydrogen will fall more rapidly over time and increasingly become more competitive. And in the rapid and net zero scenarios here, we have broadly equal amounts of blue and green hydrogen by 2050. By by 2050, although that's likely to vary quite materially across different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, it'll be very natural for them to concentrate on green hydrogen, and in other parts of the world, quite natural to focus on blue hydrogen. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm sort of interested here to see what people's views about the role of Russia emerging as a major exporter potentially of blue hydrogen. Is there a role to combine the obviously abundant natural gas reserves that Russia has with CCUS and some of those pipelines into Europe to become a supplier of blue hydrogen into Europe? I've run out of my time, Natalia, so let me stop there. Jonathan, thank you very much. We can just go back to the full screen now, and I will hand back to you, Natalia, for hopefully some questions, and even better, as always, people can point out the bits of the analysis I haven't got right. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Спенсер. Мы увидели, что прогноз стал совершенно другим, идеология прогноза поменялась радикально, все подчинено климату. То есть это выглядит так, что главным действующим фактором изменения энергетической отрасли выглядят Парижские соглашения. Все дороги ведут в Париж, получается. То есть вся деятельность подчинена задаче сокращения выбросов. Так я понимаю, выглядит сейчас идеология BP. Это интересный поворот, и по-прежнему, мне кажется, есть какое-то количество скептиков относительно именно такого вот перехода. Но я вам могу сказать, что если вы приедете в Москву, в следующем году вы увидите на улицах Москвы одно очень принципиальное изменение. У нас нет троллейбусов, все троллейбусы в Москве сняты. Троллейбусы, как вы понимаете, работают на электричестве, но они все заменены автобусами электрическими. И есть программа полной замены автобусов общественного транспорта на электрические автобусы. Ну, метро, как вы знаете, у нас тоже на электричестве. А что в Лондоне? Мой первый вопрос. У вас есть вот такое движение к электрическому общественному транспорту?
Yes, there's an increasing importance of electrification. So buses are almost entirely electrified now in London. The black cabs, which people will be familiar with, have to also be hybrid now. So you can have, but they have to run on electric when they're inside the capital of London. And you may have heard that our government announced, I think just a week ago, that it would ban the sale of internal combustion engine cars or petrol and diesel cars by 2030. And so from 2030 onwards, the sale of new petrol and diesel cars would be banned. And so we are seeing quite a rapid electrification of passenger cars and also public transportation in the UK.
Понятно, спасибо большое. Следующий вопрос, он у нас поступил от нашего давнего друга семинара Алексея Михайловича Степанова. Я надеюсь, что вы его припоминаете. Он спрашивает, это хорошо, он спрашивает о вероятностях наступления сценариев, обозначенных в вашем прогнозе. Вот какова вероятность наступления каждого из сценариев? И, соответственно, еще более глубокий вопрос. Есть, видимо, вероятность того, что эти сценарии будут разными для разных регионов мира, для крупных, там, для Азии один, для Европы другой, для Америки третий. Что вы можете сказать по этому поводу?
So on the first question about how likely they are, I sort of explicitly don't want to engage with that question in the sense of, I think all of them are equally unlikely. So the likelihood that the world will turn out like any one of these scenarios is almost infinitesimally small. I think the question sort of which I'm more worried about is how likely is the world to be somewhere between the span of uncertainty covered by these range of scenarios. So somewhere between that business as usual case and the net zero case, because that's what really matters for my strategy. Because my strategy is designed to be robust across those scenarios. And so clearly the world will turn out differently to any of these, but that was why I went through all those charts at the beginning to show that there's some trends which are pretty common across all three of those scenarios, across many countries and many regions. And so that's what we're trying to feature. That's what we're trying to focus on. And so that's sort of why, that's how I'm using scenarios. I'm using it to try to understand uncertainty and then pick a strategy which is robust to it. And at one point here, which is important to bring out, that means that in hindsight, my strategy will always be wrong, okay? Because if I knew now exactly what the world would look like, I could pick the perfect strategy. I don't, okay? So in hindsight, I will say, oh, I moved away from oil too quickly, or I moved away from oil too slowly, or for natural gas, or I should have grown renewables more quickly in this country than another country. I didn't realize. And that's true because I don't have a crystal ball. So what I'm trying to do here is pick a scenario which doesn't do brilliantly well in one scenario and then collapse in another. It does quite well across a whole range of outcomes. The suggestion that we're likely to see the world decarbonizing at different rates, I absolutely agree with that. In these scenarios themselves, we do see very different rates of decarbonization. So for example, in that rapid scenario, the EU, US and China, carbon emissions are falling by over 80% by 2050. Whereas in India, they're falling by around 50%. So even within a given scenario, we're building in the assumption that you'll see a slower pace of decline in carbon emissions in fast growing economies as they continue to grow, catch up. But Alexia is quite right. We may well see a business as usual in some scenarios and a far more rapid decarbonisation in other countries and some in again, the fact that these trends are common across those countries makes me sort of less worried about that from a company perspective. But I think it does raise that, I think that will raise quite material geopolitical and sort of trade issues over time. If we see some parts of the world decarbonising far more rapidly than others, I think that could be a significant source of both political tensions and also trade tensions. And I think that's something we should be very open to acknowledging that risk as we go forward.
Да, это важная часть проблемы перехода, что переход, конечно, будет и конкурентным, и неравномерным, это ясно. Спенсер, вы в своем докладе сказали, что хотели бы услышать комментарии по поводу водородной энергетики в России. Правильно я вас поняла?
Yes, please, yes.
Да, и у нас есть Андрей Конопляник, который, как вы знаете, большой, так сказать, такой борец за водород в нашей стране, поэтому давайте вы 5 минут отдохнете, а я дам время для комментария Коноплянику, чтобы он рассказал то, что он думает, прямо ответил на ваши вопросы. Андрей, добрый день, 5 минут вам. Пожалуйста, включите Андрея Конопляника. Модераторы, можете включить Андрея Конопляника? Андрей, ты тоже кликни на свой звук. Попробуй кликнуть. Не получается у нас?
Вот сейчас.
Давай, Андрей, 5 минут.
Да. Включили, да. Спасибо. Well, since Spencer, first of all, I'm very glad to see you. I understand that it's around 200 participants, and most of them are Russian speaking. But since your question was from you, so I will continue in English until, Natalia, you will ask me to switch to Russian. Наталья Ивановна, на каком языке лучше? На русском, на английском?
Whatever.
Okay, so then I will continue in English. There were 2 points in your presentation regarding hydrogen. First of all, you mentioned that renewable electricity and hydrogen will develop their mostly localized market, because you mentioned it's very difficult to transport the hydrogen. Fully agree with you. Moreover, I do consider it's improper to speak about long distance, high pressure transportation of hydrogen through pipelines. But in the very end, you mentioned that maybe for Russia, there is an option to produce what you called blue hydrogen. This means steam reforming plus CCS upstream in Russia, and then to think about long distance transportation of this hydrogen. From my point of view, that is totally counterproductive option. Unfortunately, in Russian energy strategy, the aim of developing hydrogen energy in Russia as one of the parameters is mentioned that we need to provide 10 billion tons of hydrogen exports. So from my point of view, that creates the wrong perceptions. And the best effective option from my point of view is the following. We shall continue to export gas to downstream European Union through the existing pipeline transportation system. Any modernization of this system for transportation of pure hydrogen mixes is counterproductive both from technical and from contractual points of view. And then we need to use not the steam methane reforming with CCS only, but in addition to this also technologies of pyrolysis, which means production of hydrogen from natural gas without CO2 emissions, because in this case there is no excess of oxygen and you can receive then clean hydrogen plus black carbon. And black carbon is not, let me say, negative for climate change. We can use this if we will market this carbon black as an additional revenue that will diminish the costs and will improve the profitability and financeability and bankability of these hydrogen projects. That is something which, from my point of view, is in the mutual benefit for Russia and European Union. And as you know, we have this Russia-European Union Gas Advisory Council, and we have been developing and discussing these options between European Commission and Gazprom, Russian Ministry of Energy, these options. And I think that these options will be the mainstream of cooperation between Russia and European Union in hydrogen area. So production of natural gas and monetization of this gas in the form of hydrogen, which will be produced downside European Union. That will create the new market niche for Russian gas in the European Union, in addition to traditional one. So that will be the piece of demand, totally new piece of demand, to use natural gas for production of clean hydrogen, as clean without CO2 emissions, as the so-called green hydrogen produced by electrolysis. Because as you have correctly mentioned, there are natural limits for production of this green hydrogen, and a lot of these limits, I will not discuss this, I see what Natalia is telling me. So that are the major points which are also answering to one of the questions that was in the chat. And sorry, thank you very much for this question. And thank you very much, of course, for your presentation.
Thank you, Andrei, and it's good to see you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Андрей, за такое оптимистическое выступление, которое подтверждает тезисы Спенсера. Как я понимаю, даже у тебя настроение такое, что, может быть, даже ситуация пойдет по более быстрому сценарию для России в смысле водорода. Ну,
да, не все так плохо, как кажется.
Хорошо,
не все так плохо.
Спасибо большое, мы рады. Да, Спенсер, я должна сказать, что в чате мы видим очень много благодарностей за вашу очень интересную презентацию, но я продолжаю двигаться по вопросам. Вот есть вопрос Розмари Гриффин, я его так немножко редуцирую. вопрос в том, насколько пандемия коронавируса повлияет на страны-члены ОПЕК. Но мы знаем, что члены ОПЕК принимают ряд решений в связи с коронавирусом. Но, собственно, вопрос глубже. Есть ли у вас какое-то представление о том, что страны ОПЕК по-разному будут реагировать на этот кризис и что, соответственно, произойдет с энергетической политикой ОПЕК в 2021 году? Пожалуйста.
Oh, okay. Is a good question, and obviously a very important question for Russia in the context of OPEC and OPEC plus. And this is somewhat different to the focus of the outlook. My view is, I guess, in some sense, is that many people like to say that OPEC's power is waning and the role of OPEC's power is waning, where I think the last 6 months has shown the enormous power that OPEC and OPEC plus can play, in that we have seen an historically unprecedented fall in oil demand. But despite that, OPEC has managed to reduce production in order to stabilize prices. And what we are seeing now are quite material draws in the levels of stocks. And many outside forecasters are expecting the level of stocks to continue to fall next year, and by the end of next year to get back to sort of close to normal levels. And so showing the role that OPEC and OPEC plus can play. The sort of the significant, and so in that sense that OPEC has played its role. The more sort of challenging or perhaps interesting bit is what happens beyond then. And so when those production cuts, as demand comes back and those production cuts can start to be have largely unwound, how do OPEC play in that world? The scenarios I showed you were one in which sort of an economically rational outcome happens, which is many of the OPEC producers realize they can't really compete with US tight oil in the short run. And so they give up market share to US tight oil, which is the marginal producer. And their production has to fall in that business as usual case against a backdrop of relatively flat demand. And they have to bide their time until a combination of both US tight oil break-even prices start to rise because the sweetest spots are used up, and also the competitiveness of OPEC production improves because of reforms in their economies. And so you see OPEC production increasing in the second half of the outlook. In contrast, US and Russian oil production is broadly flat in that scenario. So Russian production is not moving in line with OPEC, and it's moving separately. And I think, to my view, what underpins this is the competitiveness of Russian oil is very different to the competitiveness of much of the Gulf countries' oil production, and that reflects to a very large extent the fact you have a flexible exchange rate in Russia, and so your break-even price is a lot lower. And so the story here is one where Russia can compete with US tight oil, and it does so, and so that oil production remains broadly flat. Whereas for the and it can do that without running up a very large fiscal deficit because the ruble is the flexible exchange rate allow it to do that. Where you don't see that for OPEC countries. And so I think when I think about the long run, I see OPEC playing a very significant role in stabilizing the markets now, and they've played a very material role. But further out, one can see that the different competitive positions of within OPEC, some producers relative to another, and outside of that, Russia relative to those OPEC producers, may well lead to some tensions further out about how they want to behave in a world once the world gets back to normal. I hope that sort of helps to answer your question, Rosemary. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question in English from Mr. Art Franchek. And the question is, will the return of Iran to the supply of oil and natural gas have much of an effect on your forecast?
It's a good question. We do. So the assumption here is that we do see a gradual unwinding of sanctions, such that we see a gradual increase in Iranian oil production and in Iranian gas production. When you do a scenario, when you do these types of scenarios, it's very hard to build in the precise dynamics of when those sanctions are lifted. So we just generally have an approach which says the effectiveness of sanctions tends to decline over time, and so over a period of time, the sanctions either formally or informally are gradually eased, and so that production comes back. Related to the previous question, our central view is we don't see a very big increase in Iranian production in the near term. We think even if the new US administration wishes to start renegotiating as part of the JCPOA process, that could take some time. So we don't see a very bounce back, a very large bounce back in Iranian production in the very near term in terms of some of our balances. But we do see a gradual increase of both oil and gas production over time underlying these outlooks. And that was one of the reasons why sort of helping to support the growth of gas production in the Middle East. So alongside Qatar, also recognition that we'd like to see some increase in Iranian gas production.
Okay. And again, the question in English from Tatiana Razarenova. Russia keeps announcing huge oil and gas projects, mainly in Arctic. You think these projects are a mistake, or Russia may enjoy the development still in the oil and gas sector?
So Natalia's heard me say this before, but the one thing I don't do is try to give countries advice about their own policies, and I would never say a country makes a mistake in the sense that they will always know far more about their own country and their own resources than I. So I won't directly answer that question. I think one feature that I think comes out of this outlook is that we don't know, for oil demand, we don't know when oil demand will peak, and we don't know how quickly oil demand will slow and decline. In that scenario, I would imagine there will be a premium on oil projects which are relatively short cycle, short duration projects which pay back relatively quickly, because there's a sort of optionality in those projects, in the sense that if oil demand does turn out to decline more quickly than you expect, then you get a payback. Your payback is less challenged by that. So I think there may well start to see a premium on projects which are sort of scalable, short duration projects like some of the US tight oil projects, or projects in other parts of the world which are tying back to existing infrastructure, relative to very long-lived projects which in the past may have been very attractive because you get returns over long periods of time. The trouble with that is, if in some states of the world they could end up ending up being challenged if oil demand falls too rapidly. So I think certainly BP, when we're thinking about our oil projects, is sort of partly looking through this prism about how quickly does the project pay back, and then there's an attractiveness in projects which pay back relatively quickly, even if the returns on those projects may be a little bit lower, because it gives you that sort of greater insurance against the world moving rapidly relative to what you expect. Remember, that sort of key theme of ours is resilience and robustness, making sure that you sort of your you have this insurance against different states of the world.
Okay. And again, the question in English, and going back to hydrogen, from the question from Olga Nikitina: in what parts of the world, what parts, okay, maybe in what direction do you believe the blue hydrogen will be consumed most? So what are the areas and maybe fields for the blue hydrogen?
Yes. So it's a good question, and I think the honest answer is our thinking is still developing on this. In line with Andre's comments, our starting point at the moment is that trade, international trade, and particularly waterborne trade in hydrogen will be far less than we see for oil or LNG, and that's just because it's pretty costly. It's costly to transport hydrogen, and so we think the markets will be relatively localized. In a world where it's relatively localized, that suggests the choice of blue versus green will be a function of the natural resources in those countries. So if you think about a country like India, although they do have some domestic gas resources, they import all their marginal gas, but they have a huge potential in terms of solar power in particular. So that may well be a country where green hydrogen is quite important. Likewise, we may see where in other parts of the world, some parts of Northern Europe, the US, if you can find countries which both have natural gas supplies and the ability to do CCUS, then you may well see blue hydrogen. So as I say, some parts of Europe, some parts of the US, and there may be other parts of the world like Australia, which has an abundance of both, and they may well see the production of both blue and green, in the sense they have enormous natural gas resources and the potential for CCUS, plus also huge renewable energy. So I think it's driven here by my views at the moment, and I think my views at the moment are imperfect, and we're trying to do more and more work on this, but these are localized markets. So it will be patchy, some blue, some green, and the primary driver of that, sort of the natural resources in terms of, do you have access to low cost gas and can you use CCUS on one side, or alternatively, do you have big potential to expand the growth of renewable energy to go via electrolysis and produce green hydrogen?
И в продолжение этого вопроса, возможно, вопрос от Сергея Миславского, который у нас представляет сервис ВМФ. И, как вы знаете, Спенсер, он тоже постоянный участник нашего семинара и наш большой друг, который всегда продвигает повестку флотскую. Вопрос такой: может или нет ускорить переход к водороду начало морской транспортировки сжиженного водорода? То есть вот использование каких-то форм водорода, как я понимаю, там может быть каких-то смесей на основе водорода на флоте.
So this is the use of fuel, the use of hydrogen in marine transportation, not for trade.
Нет, в качестве топлива, да.
Yes. So we also see the potential role for hydrogen within marine transportation as well, and that's just similar to that of road transportation. And the reason why we see road transportation being the dominant one is just the relative sizes of demand going into those two areas. But yes, for long distance marine transportation as well, in a decarbonized world, hydrogen of one form or another also seems the natural fit and the natural choice. It'll be very hard to electrify those very long distance marine transportation. Inconceivably, one could have some sort of liquid fuels, be it biofuels or or some sort of e-fuels, but that seems less likely at the moment. So I agree that hydrogen in one form or another, perhaps in the form of ammonia or something similar to that, could well play a very material role within marine as well. That's sort of in keeping with the scenarios I showed today.
Okay. Спасибо. И у нас есть вопрос от Ольги Румянцевой. Он тоже по-английски, поэтому я его прочту. Thank you, Spencer. What role do you see for non-fossil gases, biomethane, for example, towards 2030, 2050? What do you think their share in the energy mix could be?
And sorry, Natalia, I missed it. For was that for biofuels?
Non-fossil biofuel, for example, biomethane. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, that's fine. Yes, we in other presentations, I just didn't want to talk for too long today. I have a similar slide saying what role for the hydrogen and then what role for biofuels or bioenergy. And we see a material role for bioenergy, a combination of biomass, particularly in the power sector, biofuels, helping to decarbonize transportation, particularly aviation, which is where it'll be hard to find long distance aviation. Electrification doesn't seem likely, hydrogen doesn't seem likely, and so biofuels is a role there. And also biomethane, which can be used pretty much as a direct substitute for natural gas across all sectors of the economy. And so we play a role there. I think the question and the debate, the external debate at the moment, which I think we have some views on, but I think we want to develop our views and firm them, is, if you like, what are the planetary boundaries of the role that bioenergy can play? So the question is, often discussions of climate are focused purely on climate, and they're not focused on the sustainability of the planet more generally. And the broader discussion is, look, there are costs to producing lots of bioenergy. If that ends up affecting ecosystems, it affecting the use of land for food and so on. And so I think the constraint on bioenergy, there is a very material role for bioenergy, but the constraint will be, to my mind, it will be, what can the planet sustainably supply without affecting the broader impact of sustainability? And different people come up with different numbers at the moment. So you look at some scenarios where bioenergy may be providing upwards of 80 or 100 exajoules of energy by 2050. And then there are other estimates which suggest, well, the planet can't actually sustainably provide more than 25 or 50 exajoules of bioenergy on a sustainable basis. In these scenarios, in rapid and net zero, off the top of my head, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's something like, I think it's around 40 exajoules of bioenergy in rapid and about 50 in net zero. But I think there was potential for it to play a lot bigger role, but we were constraining ourselves by this sustainability question. And I think we know we don't know enough about that question, about what the planetary boundaries are. And I think that's it's on our to-do list in terms of trying to understand that issue better.
Okay, thank you. And again, one question in English from Sergei Vakulenko. If CCUS technologies pick up, would not it be easier and cheaper to keep the energy system as it is and achieve decarbonization goal via CCUS? Even today, direct from L capture of carbon costs roughly $200 by ton. And considering the costs of various hydrogen, good old gasoline, please, CCUS looks quite cost competitive and environmentally safe. Would not it be wiser to focus on CCUS than on hydrogenization? It's clear. Sorry, my English.
Yeah, so The question is, why not do more and more CCUS instead of using hydrogen?
Exactly, yeah.
So I guess it's interesting. Normally the argument is put the other way. The argument is, why worry about CCUS if you can use green hydrogen directly, which without producing any carbon at all. So I think in our scenarios, in terms of natural gas, we have a combination of natural gas with CCUS directly, providing a direct source of power into industry and also the power sector. But we also have it producing blue hydrogen into we're also using natural gas and CCUS to produce blue hydrogen. So why bother with the blue hydrogen route? Why not just stick with CCUS, which I think is the point of the question? I think partly the answer to that is, well, there are some parts where we see hydrogen being used where it'll be a lot harder to do it directly. So for example, if I'm going to put hydrogen into trucks and long distance transportation, I can't do a combination of power of natural gas and CCUS to do that, because I can't put CCUS around the exhaust pipe of a truck. And so part of my problem here is the form in which I want to use the energy, and I can use natural gas with CCUS directly in power and industry. I can't do it in transportation. The second part is that I may well be able to the efficiency with which I can capture carbon is greater if I'm doing blue hydrogen than if I'm doing sort of natural gas and CCUS, because the carbon stream that's coming out is pure, and so the capture issue is a lot easier to do. So I think there are some issues why we think hydrogen, there's a role for blue hydrogen as well as natural gas and CCUS, but to emphasize here, we see a material role for both. And I think in both rapid and net zero, the share, and if there's a greater amount which is direct, in line with the questioner's point of natural gas with CCUS, but we also see a role for blue hydrogen for those parts of the economy, particularly those parts of the economy like in transportation, where blue hydrogen as a carrier works, where natural gas and CCUS doesn't work.
Okay, thank you very much, Spencer. And we have now 3 more minutes, and your choice. The question about LNG from the US or about the Rosneft oil growth production strategy and huge investment into the oil sector. What is your choice?
Let me talk about LNG, because I don't like talking about countries, and I like even more talking about other companies. So LNG is far better.
So Alexander Klementiev asked you, he is a little bit skeptic about your forecast of rapid growth of LNG import from the US to Europe, and he even cited the case that some customers introduced barriers for US LNG. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think it's I hope when I said it to sort of convey a sense of humility, in a sense that it's hard to know. And if the world was a pure economic model, then I'd have very little LNG imports, and Russia would win because the cost competitive or pipeline imports would win, of which Russia is a very large proportion of that. And that's just because if you can pipeline gas, you're going to be far more competitive than the cost of LNG. So LNG has a role, because if you say that Europe has concerns about about its dependency in energy security, and we've discussed in the past the validity of those arguments or not, and I'm somewhat skeptical about how strong to push that. The other dimension which is raised in this question is, and I think this is important, a really important point, which is I think this is the intent of the question, is that Europe will also increasingly care about the carbon intensity of the gas it's importing. And on many studies at the moment, the carbon intensity, the amount of carbon which is used to generate the gas, is far greater for LNG because you have all the energy production associated with the liquefaction process, then the transportation process, and the regasification process. And so if you're thinking about, and I think Europe will become increasingly focused on carbon intensity, and so there will be an additional advantage associated with pipeline gas, which is that the carbon intensity of that gas will be lower, and that will also make it more attractive. What we are seeing is some LNG exporters already are seeking ways to reduce the carbon intensity of that gas. Now, sometimes they're doing it directly by changing their operations and using renewable energy to do some of those operations, so they reduce the carbon intensity in that way. And in other times they're doing it by buying offsets, so you can buy carbon neutral LNG because they've also brought some offsets. But I think this will be an important issue going forward. And in some sense, that reducing carbon intensity is likely to incur some costs, and so in that sense will ultimately increase the competitiveness of pipeline imports or pipeline exports to Europe, including those of Russia. Whether that will be enough to offset the political concerns, I don't know, but I do think if we're having this conversation in 5 years' time, we'll be talking more about carbon intensity metrics as well as price and cost metrics.
Большое спасибо, Спенсер. Сегодня мы убедились, наша дискуссия показала, что пандемия меняет многое, почти все, но она не изменила творческого духа нашего семинара, высокого уровня презентации, новых постановок и, соответственно, очень заинтересованной реакции слушателей на все ваши новые постановки, и особенно за то, что Россия не была упущена, и наиболее острые вопросы, которые связаны с климатической повесткой, с энергоэффективностью для России, с новыми технологиями. Меня очень радует такой интерес к водороду, потому что, конечно, за этим будущее, хотя это сложное технологическое будущее, но мы ничего не боимся, ни пандемии, ни водорода. Желаем вам, Спенсер, чтобы на следующий год вы к нам приехали, и мы угостили бы вас пирожками, всех наших слушателей, всех приглашаю на будущий год. Надеюсь, все будут живы-здоровы, и все мы продолжим наши дискуссии в нашем замечательном ИМЭМО. Всего доброго, всем до свидания, всем спасибо.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you everybody for joining. It's good to catch up with everyone. Thank you.
До свидания всем.